Welcome back to our final session in R128, Are We Ready? We're going to feature three broadcasters, which Andy has euphemistically referred to as the machine gun session, so get your ammunition ready. We're going to talk about how the broadcasters are going to implement R128. So let me introduce the panel first of all. On my left, we have Kevin Burrows, CTO of Broadcast and Distribution at Channel 4. And in the middle, we have Martin Black from BskyB, he's a multi-channel sound consultant. I think it was Andy who introduced me to you, first of all, and introduced you as the man who put the B in Blitz. So, yeah. And also, you're a member of the EBU's P Loud committee. And then we've already met Andy on the far end there from BBC Technology. Let's start with Martin. Since you're on the P Loud committee, you are primarily responsible for R128 and its birth and all its growing pains. So has it come out how you wanted it?
Yeah, I think the most recent work was obviously, well, for those who don't know, the issue of the gate, which didn't exist in the original ITU spec, the 1770-1 as it's become known. The gate was the main thing that has made the loudness measurement more realistic over more program material. But obviously it's a compromise. It's the point of a loudness measurement is that and the difficulty as to why it's taken so long to come about is largely because a ppm measures a voltage, but a loudness isn't a physical parameter, it's a subjective measurement, and therefore to build a meter that measures something subjective involves the design of algorithms, etc., clearly. And that's really been the issue over why it's taken so long to get to where we are. But I think with the addition of the agreement with the ITU and EBU on a compromise setting for the gate, we've got a better tool than we had before. It's not perfect. There are scenarios where it doesn't become realistic, depending on certain types of program material, but the point is that it's a heck of a lot better than anything we've had before, and it's the tool that will certainly allow us to move from the quasi-peak paradigm that we have at the moment with a +8 or +9 limit to something that actually serves the viewer or listener more because of the fact that they're not having to adjust the volume control every 5 minutes.
We are slightly behind the rest of Europe. I think the 1st of September was the date when the Germans and the Austrians went across to R128. I think the French are still in transition, and some of the Benelux countries have gone over as well. Andy, do you think we're in a better position for being last? Can we learn from everybody else's mistakes?
It's always an interesting way of looking at things, and yes, we will be looking at, as we go through with the DPP, looking at what other implementations have actually meant. But actually, we are one of the first to go through it with the industry as a whole, as opposed to implementing it and regulating it. And as I said before, I think that's far more important that we maintain the artistic interpretation of our programmes, because we, as a country, are a net exporter of these programmes. And I think we pride ourselves on the value of the programmes, both visually and orally. And we really, really must try and defend that artistic level of interpretation and flexibility within any standard we enforce. And we have a wide range of programmes, and you know, Martin and Andy, wherever he's gone, dealing with probably two ends of the spectrum, having a measuring tool that can actually help both of them is actually quite useful. As in sport and, you know, full on, full volume, full down to something that can be silent for half an hour, and then can blow you away with 6 cannon blasts. You know, and one thing I did want to ask you is, this year we haven't had any gunshots in the proms, but that has happened before, and that has caused you problems before. But actually, 128 would have relieved you of some of those problems. Yes, especially when you can't anticipate when they're going to fire the bloody things. I think the benefit here is taking the whole of you, or you lot, with us on the whole journey of going to 128 and coming up with a practical implementation, and using people like Martin, myself and Simon, who's also part of the PLAL group, to feed back. As Martin said, it's not finished yet, and if you're on the reflector, the email reflector, it can fill your inbox, you know, one word from one of them and your inbox is full. Because one thing I've learned with sound guys is never ask them a question, not as a group. Get them on their own, hide them away and ask them one question and give them 3 minutes to answer.
It doesn't bode well for a gathering like this, then, does it?
Ask you a lot of questions.
Kevin, I mean, you're chairing the DPP's Technical Standards Committee, so this proposal now has come through that committee that we go across to R128. What's the timetable?
That's a good point. We've got some plans to, first of all, get some guidance in place, you know, towards the end of this year. One of the things we really do want to do is try and get it right, so we're not rushing into it. As we said before, we're going to tackle long form first, then short form, and then a combination of them both together. We're looking at probably Q1 to have the revised audio specification complete, which is the one we're working on at the moment. And as Andy said, it is a very much a joined industry collaboration. We're keen to get as much input as we can to make sure that we cover off absolutely everyone's experience, so that we can minimise any problems. I think it's important that we put as much guidance as we can as well, and on the DPP website we'll be adding information that we can as well for people who are perhaps not as close to it as people in the room here. And there's, again, a lot of people are perhaps not really that familiar with 128 and what it means, and certainly a lot of the, from a Channel 4 perspective, a lot of the small production companies that we deal with will probably struggle at first, but the idea is to try and give them as much guidance as we can. So,
I mean, there's a slight paradox, isn't there, that the fact that we said at the beginning it was the junctions that are the problem, it's the commercials, the trails. Now, to a certain extent, the trails are within your own control because the broadcasters make them for themselves. But obviously, the commercials being the problem, when are we going to address commercials? Because it's interesting that we're doing it that way round. Commercials are the last thing to be sorted out, whereas in France, I think they started with the commercials.
yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, I think actually when you look at the process we've got in place now, we do actually have a reasonably good process for dealing with commercials. We get very few complaints. We do have a normalisation workflow that we use for commercials. I think the main problems we tend to get are when we've got sort of legacy old films with a particular break. As you know, in the commercial environment, the same. I mean, there's colleagues from ITV and Channel 5 there as well. We tend to slot breaks in. We don't really have much control of where they go. It tends to be very editorial, so it could be within a very quiet section of the film. It could be within a very noisy section. And clearly what we're trying to do is maximise the, you know, stay within compliance for any different situation. But I think we obviously we are very keen to address it. We take a lot of care about it at the moment. We get actually very few complaints overall that we do take seriously. Part of the problem we get is that when we do get complaints, we're not sure if it's, for example, the ASA. We're not always told which platform or what type of TV they're viewing on. Is it is it an analog set? Is it a stereo set with very thin speakers that is very difficult to decipher? And just having that sort of information means we can work together to try and improve it. But I think there's no easy answer, which is why we're kind of looking at the experience and the programming and the promotional aspects first. But certainly I think from what we do today, I think there's actually a lot of care taken in dealing with commercials so that we minimise the problem.
Andy, do you want to add something to that?
We don't make commercials, but we do have promos, and some of those promos are, of course, made by the same companies as they're out with Red Bee that make quite a lot of our promos. They use companies that make commercials too, and I don't see much different between some of our promos and or trailers and commercials in terms of what the sort of target volume or target audience impact is. And I agree with Kevin. We've put in place some pretty draconian requirements for delivery of trailers, and there's nothing for programs. So in other words, it's free reign for programs. So I think we're right to start with the programs, because I said before, I don't believe it's the commercials that are always wrong. It's just that we haven't been able to normalise, if you like, our overall programme level to an average level as we went through earlier on. That would mean that if we butted all the programmes together, I still think we'd have problems. So in other words, if we can butt the programmes together and they work, we can deal with the junctions. And it will be nice actually to free the commercials and the promos up from some of the restrictions we've had to put on them, because they're just controlled by turning the volume down effectively, which means everybody's just doing back to them. It'd be nice to let them breathe a bit, and you know, if we can schedule them between good points of the programme, that's pretty good. But if actually the average volume of that junction is okay, you know, people aren't reaching for the volume knob, or if they are, it's a tiny amount, then that's fine, I think. Really, television types, there's something that's going to get worse before it gets better. I mean, the latest televisions are so thin you can't get the speakers in them, which is good news in a way because they're now bigger boxes underneath them. But I think there's going to be a move away from from internal speakers to external speakers slowly. Hopefully that will help surround. We can't satisfy every television out there because some of them are pretty awful when it comes to audio. And which is why it would be very good to know what...
Some are pretty awful when it comes to picture.
Yeah, but they always have been, though. But the audio side of it, you know, a speaker is a speaker, as everybody thinks. But actually, when it gets so thin that it can't actually move anywhere before it rattles against the grill and the backstop of the telly, we have to start to worry about it. We want more information, I think, because if we're trying to modify to a complaint through the regulators, and we find out it's coming from a television that's absolutely inappropriate for delivering any sort of audible audio, then we should be fighting back about that, not trying to compromise.
I just wanted to add one other thing to what Kevin and Andy have said about, in particular, why we're starting with programmes rather than commercials and promos, and that is, of course, that there's already the BCAP requirements for commercials in this country. So there is some kind of ultimately regulatory control where there isn't in programmes. So that was the other part of the thinking behind that.
That BCAP specification is a couple of years old now, isn't it? It was, I think it was 2010 when it was last visited. Do you think that needs revisiting again?
Definitely, but we've got to start somewhere.
One of the anomalies about that BCAP spec is it's a kind of either or. There's two ways you can do it. It mentions BS 1770 without a target value, without a gate, and then it says, but if you've got PPMs, you can do it like this. It's when it's a spec, not a spec, when it's actually trying to do two things. So do you think that it would be better if we had just one way of doing it?
But that's the aim, and I think hopefully the plan will be that we actually have that, if you like, that restriction removed and replaced with a voluntary R128 for all genres of material, including the interstitials, across all the UK broadcasters. That's certainly what we're aiming to achieve.
We have some pretty short programmes, and we have to decide how we're going to deal, what the cut-off point is between the measurement processes, when we're going to use the 3-second window, when we're going to use just the normal method of measuring, what I call long-form programming. You know, if we set a limit of 1 minute, will a commercial at 1 minute and 1 second consider itself exempt from the short form? And will the 60-second news on BBC Three have to comply with commercials requirements? So it's something we're going to have a look at the changeover point between short programmes and long commercials.
This always assumes that there are going to be different specifications for the two. So
what I'm hoping is there's going to be a different set of requirements of the same specification, because both exist, if you like, both measurement techniques exist in 128, so we have to come up with a way of saying, okay, when is it appropriate to use one set of tools and when do you need to use another set of tools? Again, we're open for discussion. So we're starting with long form. We'll get that fairly well established. I think there's more experience out there Europe-wide in long form as well. I don't think there's yet much experience in short form and commercials controlled by 128 yet, and we need to investigate that slightly. What we don't want to do, the worst thing we could do, is come up with a standard that doesn't quite work and then come up with another one. We've got something that doesn't quite work now, so we don't want something else that doesn't quite work.
For what you're classifying as long form programmes, the short-term measurement, this 3-second window, you're not going to introduce that.
With a relatively short piece of material, the R128 measurement as an indication of its loudness becomes less and less accurate. The longer it is, the better it is. And therefore there isn't a problem with long form. But the issue is, how long does it need to be before it's useful enough? And that's yet to be decided. So that hasn't been set in stone yet. But in the meantime, if people get experience of R128 the way it's supposed to work, then we'll all be better informed as to how best to work it for the short form material. But the point of that, as Andy says, the integrated measurement is the measurement that works in long form, but it doesn't work very well in short form. So you then have to look at specifying maybe either a maximum of either the momentary 40 millisecond integrated measurement or the 3-second short-term measurement, more likely the latter, I suspect. That way, if you have very quiet atmos for 50 seconds and then 10 seconds of speech at the end, you can actually get a more accurate measurement by just measuring the last little bit.
Kevin, what are we going to do about legacy programs that obviously been mixed to PPM6?
Well, we're looking at the various options. One of the things we have done is put some processors in the transmission chain. We're not actually using them yet because we want to do this piece of work and work out the best way of doing it. But one sort of method that we thought could work quite well is actually schedule-driven devices for particular programs. In our case, it's really the old sort of films that have given us problems in the past, and generally that's where they tend to put sort of commercial breaks within sort of quiet parts, and that to a certain extent that might that would definitely help that area. In an ideal world, we wouldn't do that, and what we wouldn't want to do is have some processing downstream when we're going forward with new programs that are delivered exactly compliant to 128. We don't want to actually further process anything. So I think a schedule-driven process is the right approach for that.
Does that mean you're loudness normalising on the transmission output rather than at ingest?
I think on the basis that most of our material is actually already stored digitally, the other option is to go back and run a file converter program on those or some sort of plug-in. But actually, you're probably better off leaving the original as it is, and so in the future, if you want to do any processing with it, you haven't then got to go back and try and get the original. So where it's already ingested, it would make sense to do the processing downstream, and then it leaves the existing asset as it is.
Is that the same for BBC?
My gut reaction is in the early days we won't do anything at all to legacy. We did, as an experiment, stick some metering across all the SD channels, the main SD channels, so that's 1 to 5, 3 months. And the average volume over that period, believe it or not, was -23, plus or minus dB and a bit. So, which is really strange. If you think about how R128 was developed, it's obvious that's exactly what's going to happen. The great thing about the DPP is we're sharing experience. And I think that's one thing we as broadcasters have got out of it, is sharing the experience of different ways of working for the different channels we've got, because we've all got channels with no commercial breaks in the programmes, and we've all got channels that we're splitting something up. And Dave is an example of BBC programmes heading towards commercial channels. So it's been quite interesting to learn from others what's happening. So we'll stand back on this one and wait and see what the commercial guys come up with.
I think it might be a good point to take some questions.
Ian Bushaw, ITFC Deluxe. We process thousands of hours of material for commercial broadcasters, acquired material, every year. And of course, all of these people creating this material are outside of the 128 environment, if you like. This is going to add considerable time and therefore costs to our clients for us to process all these feature films, for example, for broadcast. So is the industry ready to absorb these extra costs?
Yeah, I mean, in Channel 4 in particular takes a lot of acquisitions, although we know that the US studios are now working to the US CALM Act, which is very similar, I mean, plus or minus a dB. I think the idea is that we don't want to make this a very expensive problem if we can avoid it. And actually, again, through experience, once we've processed quite a lot of this material, we might find it's actually not a big issue going forward, certainly for the newer material.
We get 5.1 theatrical mixes, which are designed to be in that environment, but in the home environment with background noise and all the other stuff around, we need to generally compress that material. So we need to somehow get the message out to the people who are doing the mix to be able to create us a UKTV mix, if you like, to try and cut the costs at this end.
Yes, you're right. I think one of the areas that we're quite interested in and keen to progress is the stereo down mix, because a lot of people with 5.1 systems won't actually have a general problem if we don't process it. I think where you do get a problem is people that are listening on, you know, as we mentioned before, flat screens with very tinny speakers, where the mix down isn't done properly, and therefore there is a level difference between, say, the ads and the programme. So I think our sort of probably the focus will be on that mix down and what we can do to try and improve that. Certainly rather than messing about with the 5.1, which we know has been, you know, crafted very well, and obviously what we don't want to do is you know, spoil that.
We're currently in the throes of cross-loading, ingesting a lot of material, which we're doing to R128 as we go, so that we're kind of fixed as kind of the opposite of the Kevin's approach, where we're trying to fix things at ingest and then use file-based processing and processes, batch processes, to make the material correct before it actually gets to transmission, so that we can avoid having to process on the output, which we've never done since very early years, and we don't want to do at all if we can avoid it. So in the long term, we're in quite a good position, but certainly there'll be quite a long transitory period where we'll have material that either hasn't been normalised or needs more work as it's ingested. So there'll be quite a lot of to and fro, I think, with people such as yourselves to get a pragmatic solution working.
There's not going to be an R128 day where everything is compliant. Never will be. There's more likely to be an R128 day when we say all programmes commissioned from this point, in other words, all new material must be compliant. And that's similar probably for commercials, all programmes delivered from a certain, or commissioned from a certain date. That means there's a huge rollover period. As I said, we're in a situation now where everything is sort of okay, but occasionally we get caught out. Ofcom works on complaints. Those complaints always cause us problems. So if we can be seen to be doing something about it, but the rollover period is going to take quite some time, the bulk of our material end up all being okay. That there isn't, we can make a decision on how we treat it longer term, and I don't think we're going to rush into that decision. You know, we're certainly not going to rush into it and say everything must be compliant from this day. We'll see how it sits, and if it doesn't sit, we'll have to think again.
Where do you see the final QC taking place? Within the broadcaster or at the post-production house?
We are looking at moving QC back to the productions. The requirement for QC back to the person that makes the programme. It's their name on it. We can set up a set of requirements, and you can use automation and eyeballs as in combination. And I think that's some things you're going to see from us as in the DPP group later. R128 is probably one of the areas where automation can help, certainly in checking compliance. And there's lots of tools around that will do that very nicely. And you yourself know you have tools that actually make things compliant. I don't want to get down the road of having to make things compliant. I'd rather people, you know, started making programs that they listened to. And as I think you got from the sound guys, it's about using the ears again. So it should help. That should help a lot. In terms of producing this stuff that's going to sound nice as well as be compliant. But in terms of QC, we want to get away from the draconian enforcement, because when we do it, it applies to everything. We can't actually be pre-selective about it. You know, stuffing something in your transmission chain will comply something that's good but not fully compliant, and something that's bad, and it'll make them sound the same. I don't want to get into this sort of discovery 2 dB's dynamic range area because of syndication. Because, you know, we've made programs for that and it doesn't work.
We already do that for a lot of our program suppliers. So we have a concept of trusted suppliers. So, for example, Line Pictures, who make many programs for us over every week, you know, we will only spot check them. We know they're consistent quality. We have a list of trusted suppliers, so we won't do a full QC, and then we'll do a spot check on the basis that, you know, we've never had a problem with them in the last few years. So we're kind of moving that way anyway. It's just a question of trying to get that one step further. So, but again, it's something we are actively talking about within the DPP, so we can try and get some, you know, overall agreement and guidance as to how we want to do it. And as Andy said, part of that is a separate work stream on QC, so that we can make sure the tools actually give us what we need and try and get some sort of commonality across the different manufacturers.
When we spoke to UK Screen members, they actually said that the consistency of the R128 meters was actually very, very good. That didn't seem to be a problem. But it was interesting that on one certain manufacturer's stand at IBC,
That's right. We did see quite a difference in readings between 3 automated QC processes, and particularly around the 128 as well. Although we haven't gone into the detail of seeing how they were set up. I mean, it's possible that there was another level of detail there to set them up equivalently. But that's something that we will be doing in the future. Is trying to sort of test things in conjunction with UK Screen. I think we need to get the experience to know that the manufacturer's readings are going to be as consistent as possible. So.
Well, as Andy said, this is a separate work stream, and it's really a bit off topic for today, but it is actually quite a major change in the workflow and the relationship between facilities and broadcasters.
Perfectly well. I mean, we only have to take one particular regulatory requirement, as I call it, which is the photoepilepsy testing. We know perfectly well the biggest argument we have is not about pass or fail, it's about what your machine said opposed to what our machine said. And I think that's one area where we are looking at much more diversity in the range of equipment available and much better interpretation. And we thank Citroën Commercial very much for the ability to say that now we can use any device that's compliant as long as we've done our best to test. We will be saying that any device that meets the Ofcom requirement is satisfactory, and we're already piloting a couple within our repeats area to move away from just one supplier there.
Slightly tangential thing, but coming back to the R128 spec, that's worth mentioning is that if you have a meter which says it has an R128 mode, it has an R128 mode. If you start changing any of the parameters, which a lot of manufacturers allow you to do, then it stops being R128 compliant. So just push the R128 button and use it.
And actually what we're feeding back into the QC device makers, manufacturers, is that R128 is R128. Okay, there might be changes to it, but everybody will update those changes on the same day at the same time, as far as we're concerned.
Just following up the QC, you say there's not going to be an R128 day. I think therefore there's some confusion in the market in terms of the practical issues about tech delivery, in terms of at what point do you stop saying PPM 6?
We know that it's very difficult once a program is commissioned to change the requirements of that program. If it's in post-production, it's impossible. So we will have to put it into the commissioning chain now. Whether or not we can force that through to say after a certain date and put that date far enough in the future. We don't want to be too far in the future. After a certain date, all programs must be delivered to, this is new programming, to R128. I don't know. That's something we'll have to discuss amongst ourselves. But certainly a commissioning day is a definite. Whether it's a delivery day yet, we don't know.
Yeah, that absolutely comes back to the messaging.
Yeah, it is, exactly, yeah. And I think that's that's one of the reasons for going through this whole process. Days like this, more days to come, is to get the best possible delivery guide we can out into the public domain as quickly as possible, and then set a date for using it.
You've got this long lead-in on the commissioning process. Surely it doesn't matter until you're actually just about to go into post-production. That's the point you need to know what you're going to deliver to, because actually the acquisition of it, all the stuff that's gone before, it doesn't really matter.
We're a continuous delivery of programs, so it is about, as you say, it's about comms, it's about publication, it's about time, and it's about knowledge, making sure everything's ready to do it. I mean, if you look at the C Day, which is the last big day we had in the UK for commercials, it was a long time in the coming, wasn't it? And then suddenly happened. And I can't see we can't learn from that experience. It worked reasonably well. There will always be problems, but yeah, let's get the standards out there. Let's get the guide out there. Finish the discussion, and then say, okay, we have a commissioning day. Absolutely, programs from this point will be delivered to R128, and then if we implement a delivery date as well, might be a slight gap between the two to allow bedding in. And we're not going to say programs will fail. What I did for the proms, for the non-live proms, is just say, right, R128 approved by me on them. So we will have a process maybe of asking for a short period of time that R128 programs are identified very clearly, and so we can pick that up on the way in and not fail them if we're doing QC on them, and then do a transition that way. So it's still all to be discussed, and that's it about broadcasters' internal processing. But we will try and coordinate that so at least we can start on the same day.
This is not linked necessarily to the transition to file-based delivery. So you will be accepting tape-based programs with R128?
We could make tape exempt, actually, and say, just sod it, it's tape.
Yeah, I mean, obviously over the next year we're expecting to ramp up on file deliveries in any case, so we're hoping the volume of tape is going to go down over time. And the sort of time we're talking about is probably, you know, end of 2013, 2014, where we want to be kind of 100% EBU 128 where we can be.
We've said that tape will be dead for delivery by 14, sometime in 14 for all of us. Part of the DPP file delivery coming fully into implementation. We could tie in the R128 to it. I think we might want to go faster on 128 because it is more achievable. It's less of an impact to the whole process. It's more about, you know, the post-production end basically than it is about the end-to-end process.
I mean, in your commissioning process, you've got some very long timescales, haven't you? So, you know, natural history programs could be 4 years, yeah.
The model there is the move from HDCAM after the trial to HDCAM SR. We had a program that was commissioned that was delivering in 3.5 years that could have delivered on HDCAM. By the time we got there, they didn't want to. You know, it was not in their interest. So some of the long ones we don't have to worry about because you'll have to find a dubbing mixer that can do PPM 6.
You have to find PPM.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. How much leeway are you going to give people, you know, if they're not delivering out of a dubbing suite? You know, you're expecting everybody who's delivering out of an Avid in a bedroom or an Avid in the back of the production office, you're expecting them to hit the same tolerances? If you're mixing to peak level metering, stereo, let's say, we're going to probably safely say these programs will be stereo. If anybody's trying to do surround in the back of an office, then they deserve exactly what comes out. So let's say these programs are stereo, they're not going to be far out doing what they currently do. Whether or not we need to then tweak that in and have a look at some of the tools that are floating around now. We've had some really successful discussions with people like Avid, maybe not Apple, but other manufacturers, Adobe, about the fact there are plugins that can help you, you know, from very, very cheap quick analyzers through to quite reasonably cheap but, you know, more expensive compliance tools. And I think, you know, once we get a standard out there, once people know that it's going to happen, there's a big industry out there that's very keen to make things for it, and it's not rocket science, some of it. So I think you'll find that once we've decided what's got to happen, the tools will start to arrive as well, in addition to the tools, if you like, at the high end that already exist. The cost of those tools is not prohibitive. I don't think it is. I think some of them will be very low cost.
Just going back to the kind of the beginning really, and talking about our European colleagues. You know, the French spec talks about sort of 2 minutes as being short form and a different spec for long form. Is there any feedback at all that you've had about how well it's working? Because it's very kind of strict, and you know, certainly a few of our customers delivering to France have found it problematic meeting the momentary and the short and all these different values. And it sounds like you've got a very pragmatic approach by waiting a bit longer, but also I think, you know, people do need something set in stone to work to.
One of the recommendations that PLOUD currently make is that for short term, it's most likely that I mentioned earlier that the requirement will be either a maximum momentary or a maximum short term, but not both. And I think that one or two broadcasters have made that mistake. So we've been lucky because we've learnt from that. It's interesting that what you say about the 2 minutes, because I suspect that's probably more or less where it's going to land. So we can, through the European group that Simon and I chair as well, we've got some very good representatives in France as well as the other European countries, and that's something that we'll have definitely going to do a roundup of people's experiences. So again, we can harvest the pains of others to avoid them ourselves.
What you're saying there, rather than trying to define short form as a genre by saying it's a minute or whatever, you might say, well, we've defined short form as the point at which integrated loudness stops being as accurate as it might be.
The problem is, how do you can't say that to a commercial producer, because that's a judgment call that isn't part of the spec. So that's not really a enforceable or repeatable spec. So I think ultimately you may come up with an arrangement where it's a different duration for commercial from a promo, for example, because of that specifying how those genres are defined. But that's a whole part of a piece of work that I think a bridge yet to cross.
You say that's there's a subjective judgment come into play here, and when you're sitting in an edit suite or a dubbing suite with a producer alongside you who wants everything louder than everything else, that needs to have some kind of management training. We were talking about this with the BBC Academy. That was mentioned very much, that it needs to be a top-down to begin with to get people to buy in. So is that something that the DPP can do, or is it something the broadcasters are going to do with their own indies?
We had a session actually earlier today with the BBC Academy, and I think what they're keen to do is talk to us and basically put the guidance together with all our input as well as the input we get from yourselves. So I think it's in the future, when we have sort of guidance on the DPP website, on the guidance from BBC Academy, then we need to make it all consistent, and so it is all about just working together as an industry to do that, because we see a lot of value in it. At the end of the day, we all want to be singing the same message.
Will you be putting any more emphasis into that acquisition training to making sure that we get...
You're right, we will. I think one of the areas of the DPP is not just about technical delivery, it's about best practice. It involves PACs, it involves the people making the programmes. We'll be engaging really heavily with the people who are running those bits of the DPP to make sure this goes out to all the production community as part of best practice. And what the really good thing about it is, and I know this from Andy and other guys that have done this, is if we impose a standard and the producer goes and talks to the people who are going to deliver that, and they say, oh yeah, I'm happy with that, we've discussed that, it gives them a lot of confidence that it's not an imposition on them and it's going to work. But also it gives you the bit of background when you're sitting in that edit suite and someone's driving you and you say, are you really sure you want to do this? I'm quite happy to do it, but what happens if your programme comes back? And they've already been briefed to know that we don't want the programmes like that, and we will send them back.
That message of cooperation is great. This is the last sort of round of questions. I would like each of you to say in one sentence, how well do you think R128 is going to work? What's it going to do for us? And when are the viewers going to notice?
I think in some ways it's when the viewers don't notice is actually a good sign, because if we get it right, they shouldn't notice. They should actually not come up with any complaints. They should actually find the audio levels correct. So I think that's ultimately what we need to aim for. So really, I think it should work. There's nothing really from what we've seen so far that means it shouldn't work. There's a bit of learning to go through, but other than that, I think it sounds very promising.
The cooperation with the DPP is the crucial thing here, I think, because what it means is that you're not having to argue with the production person about delivering to a specific client, say. What you've got is a combined front, if you like, that we're all in this together, and I think that's the most crucial thing. The other thing I would say to you, as something to go away with, is it's been covered many times already today, and you particularly touched on this point about the free loudness meter, which is actually very true. You can actually paste up all your meters. So the fear of, how do I do this? I've got to keep looking at a meter. Actually, you'll find that it's not like that at all if you haven't tried it already. So it's not really an issue.
I think the easiest one is when you stop ringing me and bending my ear about different delivery requirements.
Okay, we'd like to thank our panel.